Police find 4 small bodies in a house on the outskirts of the Mexican city of Los Mochis. The mother, the only official tenant of the house, has vanished without a trace. None of the neighbors even suspected that the house on Ignacio Allende Street hid such a terrible secret. On the evening of November 20th, 2022, 2 municipal police officers arrived at a call to the house at Ignacio Allende Street, house number 47. The complaint came from neighbors about a strange smell and constant noise coming from the building that had been vacant for several weeks. At the scene, police found a locked door, but with the consent of the house owner, they broke it open. Inside, among construction debris and scattered clothing, officers discovered 4 neatly rolled identical bundles. They lay in the depths of the room, covered with old boards and plaster. In the official protocol, police noted that the tenant, Alejandra Moreno, 30 years old, had stopped making contact with the property owner 2 weeks ago. None of the neighbors had ever seen the small residence with her whom the officers discovered. The police report described the details in detail. Each of the 4 bundles was wrapped in a sheet faded by time with an almost worn-out floral pattern. The bundles were tightly tied with rope. On top of them lay pieces of dried plaster and broken brick, as if someone had hastily hidden them by covering them with debris. At the entrance, next to the threshold, small children's shoes of different sizes were neatly stacked. Worn sneakers, sandals that had lost their color, and house slippers covered with mold. The kitchen looked abandoned. Dirty dishes, several empty bottles, and a package of expired tablets on the table. The prescription bore the name of a doctor, Dr. Ramirez, a psychiatrist at the Los Mochis City Clinic. The investigation began with neighbors and Alejandra Moreno's immediate circle. The first to arouse police suspicion was Carlos Rojas, 42 years old, a handyman who had settled in the neighboring house 2 months before the incident. He was the one who informed police that he had heard strange screams from Alejandra's house for several weeks. Carlos claimed that one night he saw a car drive up to the house, but could not describe the make or license number. The second person of interest was Mario Salazar, 35 years old, an unemployed musician and Alejandra's former cohabitant. Neighbors said the couple had separated about 6 months ago, and Mario had appeared at the house for some time with loud scandals, demanding to be let back in. He was last seen here a month before Alejandra's disappearance. Carlos Rojas almost immediately became the main suspect. Police established surveillance of his house and requested recordings from video cameras at the nearest building materials store. The cameras recorded how Carlos for 3 consecutive days carried and dumped large bags with construction debris remains at the local dump. This coincided with the preliminary conclusions of experts. The bundles were covered with similar materials. However, the sizes of the discarded bags, according to the expert opinion, did not match the sizes of the bundles found in the house. Thus, police did not obtain direct evidence of Carlos Rojas's involvement. The forensic expert's conclusion sharply changed the course of the investigation. According to preliminary analysis of the remains, one of the discovered beings died at least 4 months earlier than the others. This circumstance completely ruled out the version of a simultaneous incident and forced investigators to completely reconsider the picture of events. The data showed that precisely then, Alejandra was active on social networks, went to work, and regularly visited shops, which was confirmed by numerous witnesses. The investigation received a new turn, leaving the investigation with the necessity to determine Alejandra's movements and environment during the period coinciding with the death of the first victim found in the house. Police immediately paid attention to Carlos Rojas's strange behavior. If he regularly took construction debris to the dump, why did his own house show no signs of renovation? The morning of November 21st began for police with a detailed check of Carlos Rojas's lifestyle. From the moment of discovery in the house on Ignacio Allende, police continuously monitored him, recording his movements and contacts. Investigators managed to obtain recordings from the solid waste landfill on the outskirts of Los Mochis, where Carlos regularly came in recent weeks. According to the obtained data, Rojas had taken 9 bags weighing approximately 6 kilograms each over 2 weeks. But when investigators decided to inspect his house, it became obvious that Rojas had not conducted any renovation at his place. Carlos was invited for interrogation to clarify details. The investigator provided him with receipts from the landfill demanding explanations. Rojas looked calm and confident. He explained that recently he often took on side jobs at small construction sites. "I was just throwing away old plaster that remained after work." However, when the investigator asked him to provide contacts of clients or any confirmations of this work, Rojas answered evasively, "These were small tasks, verbal agreements. People paid cash. I didn't ask names." Investigators tried to establish at least one person who could confirm Carlos's words, but unsuccessfully. None of the neighbors or acquaintances saw him leave for any side jobs. On the contrary, many described him as uncommunicative and withdrawn. When asked why he didn't throw away all the garbage at once but stretched the process over several days, Carlos briefly answered that the bags were heavy and inconvenient to transport. An important detail was that Carlos was not listed in any of the official registers of contractors or builders. Moreover, neighbors told police they had never heard construction noise in Carlos's house. The banging and strange sounds that repeatedly disturbed street residents came exclusively from Alejandra Moreno's house. The neighbor across the street, Cecilia Mendez, 56 years old, retiree, confirmed, "Carlos's house is always quiet. But at Alejandra's, someone periodically knocked and made noise at night. I even approached her door a couple of times, but no one opened for me." Cecilia's testimony was also confirmed by other residents of Ignacio Allende Street. Carlos's house, despite the suspicious activity of the tenant himself, remained quiet and inconspicuous. Despite this, police decided to thoroughly check the plaster that Rojas took to the landfill. The investigation put forward the assumption that this was exactly how he got rid of evidence. The version looked convincing. Plaster and stucco remains also covered the bundles found in Alejandra's house. A forensic expert immediately took plaster samples from the landfill where Carlos went and compared them with what was discovered in Moreno's house. While the laboratory check was being conducted, police kept Rojas under surveillance without charging him. However, neither his behavior nor his lifestyle indicated attempts to hide or destroy any additional evidence. On the contrary, he behaved calmly, almost demonstratively avoiding suspicious actions. No tools, traces of renovation work, or additional materials that could shed light on the strange trips to the dump were found in his house. Toward evening on November 21st, the results of the laboratory examination of the plaster came in. Experts quickly dispelled police suspicions. According to the official conclusion, the composition of plaster from the bags thrown away by Carlos Rojas differed drastically from the construction debris found together with the bundles in Alejandra Moreno's house. The samples from the landfill contained specific impurities of industrial origin, completely absent in the materials that covered the remains. The version that Carlos was trying to hide the crime by getting rid of plaster at the dump was officially closed by the investigation. Nevertheless, police did not completely remove suspicions from Rojas. The lack of an alibi and strange behavior forced them to consider him an important witness, possibly hiding more information than he was ready to report during interrogation. Carlos Rojas remained under covert surveillance for now, although formal charges against him were dropped. A strange gap arose in the case. Why had none of Alejandra Moreno's relatives turned to police, although the small residence had disappeared for several months? After the investigation temporarily dropped charges against Carlos Rojas, attention switched to Alejandra Moreno's circle. On the morning of November 23rd, the investigator summoned Paulina Moreno, 28 years old, the missing woman's sister. Paulina looked agitated, but immediately began actively cooperating with the investigation. During the conversation with police, Paulina confirmed that for the last 2 years she had practically not communicated personally with her sister. "We only corresponded through WhatsApp," she explained. Alejandra avoided personal meetings, always found excuses. She said she was working, busy, asked me not to come. When the investigator asked about the small residence, Paulina became noticeably nervous, but then clearly answered. She told me they were living temporarily with grandmother. I believed her. Alejandra said that grandmother was a doctor, that she would take better care of them. The investigator immediately checked the information. The results were stunning. The only grandmother who could match this description, the mother of Alejandra and Paulina herself, had died back in 2020. Paulina could not possibly have been unaware of this fact, and her explanation looked extremely suspicious. Additional investigation showed that back in June, August, and October of 2022, 3 anonymous complaints were received by the social services of Los Mochis stating that minors were living in inappropriate conditions in the house on Ignacio Allende. However, no inspections based on the complaints were ever conducted, and the reasons for the service's lack of response to the appeals remained unclear. During additional questioning, the investigator insisted that Paulina explain the contradictions in her testimony. Paulina sharply denied that she had intentionally covered for her sister. She claimed that Alejandra constantly changed conversation topics and avoided answering direct questions about her children, citing being busy and feeling unwell. As proof, she provided messenger correspondence where her sister regularly wrote about the supposedly normal life of the little residents at grandmother's house. However, the police noted that the messages were dry and brief, almost identical in content. It was obvious that Alejandra was intentionally distancing herself from Paulina and avoiding any detailed conversations. Despite this, Paulina did not doubt the truthfulness of her words and did not even try to visit her sister personally or at least call the police. The investigators began working on the version of Paulina's involvement in attempting to hide the disappearance of the little residents. Her smartphone and computer were voluntarily provided to the police for analysis. Experts carefully studied the sisters' correspondence, email, call history, and movements. Paulina did not leave the city during the periods when Alejandra stopped making contact. No indirect evidence was found that would indicate that Paulina helped her sister hide facts about the little residents. The check showed that Paulina led an ordinary life, worked as a manager at a tourist company in the center of Los Mochis, and practically did not communicate with Alejandra except for WhatsApp messages. Suspicions against her were dropped. Toward the end of the day, the police received important information from the technical department. Experts were able to establish the time and place of sending the last voice message on behalf of the little residents that Paulina received. It was recorded in July 2022, several months before the remains were found in Alejandra's house. WhatsApp metadata showed that the message was sent from someone else's IP address, not connected to either the house on Ignacio Allende or the Moreno sisters' phones. The voice data was authentic, but the source of sending remained unknown, which sharply complicated the investigation. The fact of sending the message from another location emphasized that someone was actively participating in concealing the truth about the whereabouts of the little residents. The police officially recorded this information, deciding to thoroughly investigate the origin of the IP in the future. Alejandra Moreno remained at large. Her sister Paulina was released after questioning, but remained in the field of view of the investigation as a possible witness. The investigation unexpectedly discovered a recording from the surveillance camera of the OXXO store, located just a few steps from Alejandra Moreno's house. The lens caught Carlos Rojas on the night of the 17th of November, just 3 days before the police entered the house on Ignacio Allende. Carlos Rojas, a neighbor who had remained in the shadows after official suspicions were lifted, was once again in the field of view of the investigation. The camera recording clearly captured how around midnight he approaches the Moreno house on foot, holding in his hands a plastic container about 30 by 40 centimeters in size. Carlos calmly walked to the house, looked around as if making sure no one saw him, and quickly disappeared inside. He was there for about 15 minutes, after which he came out empty-handed and returned home by the same route. The investigator requested the protocol for examining Alejandra Moreno's house and compared it with the camera recordings. No such plastic container was recorded in the search document. A logical assumption arose that Carlos had taken something away or hidden something in the house shortly before the police arrived. Rojas came to the new interrogation voluntarily and looked confident. The investigator immediately presented the recording, to which Carlos calmly replied, "I just brought her dog food. She asked for help, and I helped. The dog was starving." In confirmation of his words, he pointed to an empty bag of food that was indeed found by the police in the house on Ignacio Allende. The brand and packaging matched Carlos's statement. In an attempt to confirm or refute his words, the police again questioned the neighbors. One of them, an elderly man named Juan Mendoza, 65 years old, confirmed that Alejandra indeed sometimes fed stray animals, and Carlos had previously helped her with this. No other witnesses to Carlos's nighttime visit could be found. The verification logistics were simple. The OXXO store was only 200 meters from the Moreno house, and Carlos walked there. His words about simply helping the woman with animals looked logical, but the police were obliged to rule out other versions. Despite the neighbor's testimony and matching details, the police put forward a new hypothesis. The investigator suggested that the container could have been used by Carlos to transport remains or evidence. Rojas himself denied any accusations and repeated that he only brought food. The plastic container that Carlos had previously used was voluntarily handed over to the police for forensic analysis. Experts took samples from the inner surface to determine if there was a connection between the container and the found remains. During several hours of waiting for results, Carlos remained at the police station under observation, but without formal charges. Toward evening, the laboratory presented the analysis results. Experts found DNA traces of only one person inside the container, Carlos Rojas himself. Not a single other trace, especially of child origin, was found in the samples. The container turned out to be completely clean of traces of the little residents of the Moreno house, confirming Carlos's words about its true purpose. The version that the container was used to move remains was definitively refuted, and the police were forced to close it. Carlos Rojas was once again outside direct suspicion. The investigators acknowledged that his testimony was truthful, but still kept him under unofficial surveillance, as some details of his behavior remained unexplained. Against the backdrop of closing the container version, a new witness appeared. On the evening of the same day, Alejandra's neighbor, a middle-aged woman named Teresa Gutierrez, 48 years old, a fruit seller, came to the police station on her own. She reported that on the night of the 17th to 18th of November, at the very time when the camera recorded Carlos, she saw an unfamiliar car near the Moreno house. Teresa remembered only part of the license plate number and the car brand, but this was enough for the police to get a new, important reference point in the case of the disappearance of Alejandra Moreno and her little residence. Now the investigation was moving in a new direction, and Teresa's testimony was becoming key for the next stage of police work. The investigation takes a new turn. Investigators detain Renato Padilla, Alejandra Moreno's new boyfriend. The man had lived with her for several months but claimed he did not know about the existence of the little residence. On the 27th of November, police took into custody Renato Padilla, 33 years old, without an official job, with no previous convictions. After talking with neighbor Teresa Gutierrez, investigators found out that it was Padilla's car that stood near Alejandra's house on the night of the 17th to 18th of November. During detention, the man did not resist and immediately agreed to interrogation. During questioning, Padilla stated that since September 2022, he and Alejandra had moved to a new house rented in his name. In confirmation of his words, he presented a rental agreement where his name was indeed listed. Investigators contacted the neighbors of the couple's new place of residence, finding out that not a single little resident had ever been seen there. Moreover, the neighbors informed the police that noisy parties and multi-day drinking sessions regularly occurred in the house, in which Alejandra, Renato, and unknown people participated. None of the neighbors even suspected any little residents. The investigators directly asked Padilla why he had never been interested in the fate of the little residents, whose existence he was aware of. Padilla looked genuinely surprised. He told the investigators, "Alejandra said they were temporarily staying at grandmother's house. I completely trusted her and never asked unnecessary questions." The police tried to verify his words through correspondence with Moreno. Analysis of WhatsApp messages showed an unusual detail. Alejandra regularly deleted messages concerning the little residents using the delete for everyone function. The function had technically existed since 2018, so experts confirmed the reality of the situation. Only neutral messages of a household nature remained in the correspondence, while any mentions of names, ages, or other details were immediately erased. Thus, Padilla's version about being unaware looked plausible, although his complete passivity and lack of curiosity remained strange. The investigation sought any possible financial motive for the couple's actions. A hypothesis was put forward that Padilla could have received insurance or other monetary compensation after the disappearance of the little tenants. However, police verification showed that no insurance, inheritance, or other potential payments were registered in the names of Moreno or Padilla. The financial motive quickly lost relevance and was closed as false. But on the evening of the 27th of November, the examination presented the investigation with a new important fact. Analysis of documents for receiving social benefits paid to Alejandra for the maintenance of the little tenants showed that for the last 3 months, instead of Moreno's signature on the receipts, there was the signature of Renato Padilla. The monthly payments amounted to about 8,000 Mexican pesos. Not a huge sum, but significant for the unemployed Padilla. The investigators could not immediately draw unambiguous conclusions. Whether Padilla was committing fraud of his own free will, or whether Alejandra Moreno was putting pressure on him, forcing him to sign documents instead of her. During interrogation, Padilla claimed that he did this at Alejandra's request, who often complained of poor health and asked him to process the papers independently. Handwriting analysis confirmed his testimony that the signatures indeed belonged to him. The police did not have sufficient grounds to immediately accuse Padilla of complicity. However, the fact of his involvement in receiving benefits cast doubt on the sincerity of his previous testimony about complete ignorance regarding the little tenants. The question of the degree of his involvement in the events that occurred in Alejandra Moreno's house remained open. The focus of attention once again was on the sister of the missing Alejandra Moreno, Paulina. Experts finally determined from where the last voice message was sent on behalf of the little tenants. The IP address led to an unexpected place. On the morning of the 30th of November, Paulina Moreno, 28 years old, Alejandra's sister, was summoned for questioning again. Despite the previous check, the police were again interested in her role in the case. By this time, technical expertise had established the exact origin of the IP address from which the last voice message from the little tenants to Paulina was sent in July 2022. The IP address led investigators to a small internet cafe located approximately 5 kilometers from the house on Ignacio Allende. According to logistical data, the establishment could be reached by bus number 2 in 12 minutes. The police requested surveillance recordings from the internet cafe on the date the voice message was sent. The cameras clearly captured a person in a hood, hiding their face, entering inside. Experts were able to approximately determine the height of the unknown visitor, about 168 centimeters. The parameters did not match either Alejandra Moreno's height of 171 centimeters or Paulina's 160 centimeters. This circumstance immediately introduced new uncertainty into the investigation, but the police continued to check Paulina's possible involvement. During repeated questioning, Paulina appeared more composed and confident than before. The investigator directly asked the question, where was she on the day the last voice message was sent, which came to her phone? Paulina immediately provided evidence of her alibi, data from the access control system from her workplace, a tourist company in the center of Los Mochis, which confirmed her presence at the workplace throughout the entire day. Check-in and camera recordings at the office entrance completely ruled out the possibility that at the specified time she could have been in the internet cafe. After detailed verification of her words, the investigators concluded that Paulina physically could not have sent this message herself or been at the place of sending. Her involvement in this action was completely excluded. Thus, the version according to which Paulina Moreno could consciously help her sister hide the disappearance of the little tenants was finally removed from the agenda. Documents, video recordings, and testimonies from colleagues completely confirmed her innocence. The investigators officially closed this false trail. At the same time, Paulina's behavior did not seem completely explicable to the investigators. During questioning, she admitted that she had long suspected problems in her sister's life, but did not take active action due to tense relations with Alejandra and being busy at work. This passivity looked suspicious, but formally did not contradict the law. However, the investigation of the internet cafe presented yet another unexpected turn. During the verification of the establishment's records and documents, investigators discovered a preserved payment receipt for computer time. The receipt was signed by a previously unknown person, identified as S. Diaz. The signature and name did not match any of the known participants in the case. The cafe employee confirmed that payment was made in cash, and the visitor did not present documents, but wrote the name by hand, as is often done when paying in cash. Thus, the investigation sharply turned toward a new, previously unfigured personality. The signature S. Diaz became a new mystery requiring urgent verification. Investigators recorded this data and set themselves the task of urgently establishing the identity of the woman who made the payment in the internet cafe on that very day, when the voice message was sent on behalf of the little tenants. The focus of the investigation was on our social services employee, Inspector Sergio Diaz. The investigation sharply changed course after it became clear why 3 complaints about the Moreno family were never investigated. On the morning of the 2nd of December, the police summoned Social Services Inspector Sergio Diaz, 45 years old, a civil servant with 15 years of experience, for questioning. The reason for the summons was the previously discovered records from the internet cafe with the signature S. Diaz. Verification of complaint logs in the city's social services showed that Inspector Diaz was handling the Moreno family case and was responsible for processing 3 complaints received in June, August, and October 2022. Upon careful examination of the complaints log, it turned out that Inspector Sergio Diaz personally closed all 3 applications regarding the Moreno family with the note, "Checked. Family does not reside at the specified address." However, the inspector provided no documentary recording of the visit or photographs of the inspection. Internal verification of social services revealed that Diaz processed the closure of complaints without mandatory confirmations and signatures from neighbors or witnesses, violating official instructions. During questioning, Diaz confidently told the investigator that he had visited all 3 complaints personally, but Moreno's house was always closed and looked uninhabited. "I visited several times, rang the doorbell, no one answered. The house looked abandoned. That's exactly why I noted in the report that the family doesn't live there," he said. However, logistical verification of the GPS tracker of the social services official vehicle showed otherwise. In the last 6 months, not a single visit by the vehicle to Ignacio Allende Street was registered. Diaz explained the absence of records as a technical malfunction of the GPS system. However, the technical department of social services refuted his words, confirming the complete serviceability of the equipment throughout the entire time. The police assumed that Inspector Diaz's actions could be explained by corruption and bribery from Moreno or her circle. A search was conducted at Diaz's workplace and home. No traces of large sums of money, unjustified purchases, or suspicious bank transfers were found. Bribes were thus excluded. The version of corrupt conspiracy turned out to be false and was officially closed. However, the investigators' attention was drawn to a completely different finding. During a search of Diaz's personal locker at the workplace, police discovered several packages of antidepressants. The medications turned out to be exactly the same as those previously found in Alejandra Moreno's house. prescribed by the same doctor, Dr. Ramirez. Dr. Ramirez, a psychiatrist at Los Mochis City Clinic, had previously figured in the case only indirectly. Now he unexpectedly became an important link connecting Inspector Sergio Diaz and Alejandra Moreno. The investigation could not find direct evidence of exactly how Diaz turned out to be connected with Dr. Ramirez and why both of them contacted Alejandra. Nevertheless, the fact of the common connection of all three through the prescription and use of antidepressants was recorded. The investigation has not yet made any official conclusions about Inspector Diaz's role in the case of the little tenants of the house on Ignacio Allende. However, it became obvious that Inspector Diaz was hiding significantly more information than he was ready to tell the police during the initial interrogation. His personal connection with Dr. Ramirez and the medications found in Moreno's house forced investigators to consider a completely new perspective on this complex case. Sergio Diaz was temporarily suspended from work in social services until all circumstances were clarified. The police took his connections and contacts under close surveillance to understand what relation he could have had to the tragic events in the Moreno house. On the 15th of January 2023, Alejandra Moreno was detained by police on the outskirts of Los Mochis. After almost 2 months of secrecy, she was discovered in a small motel where she had settled under a false name. At the same time, Sergio Diaz remained suspended from work and was under house arrest, cooperating with the investigation. Diaz's testimony finally revealed the chain of events and established the connection between him, Moreno, and Dr. Ramirez. Alejandra Moreno confessed that in June 2022, the eldest of the small residents, 9-year-old Sofia, died due to severe exhaustion and lack of proper care. Fearing responsibility and possible imprisonment, Alejandra decided to hide what had happened. It was then that she first met Social Services Inspector Sergio Diaz, who came following neighbors' complaints about the troubled situation. Diaz, being in severe dependence on antidepressants prescribed by Dr. Ramirez, proposed a deal to her. Moreno signed papers about supposedly conducted inspections, and Inspector Diaz in return received medications, prescriptions for which he regularly sold through the doctor. The scheme worked almost without failures for several months. But in October 2022, the remaining 3 small residents died in Moreno's house from severe condition and lack of normal nutrition. This time, the scheme failed. Alejandra again demanded help from Diaz, and he, fearing to lose access to medications, continued to close social services reports without inspection. The investigation restored all circumstances of the case in detail. The bags with plaster that Carlos Rojas took to the dump had no relation to the found remains. Alejandra herself bought construction materials to mask the storage place of the remains, excluding Carlos from the suspects. Receipts from the construction materials store confirmed that Moreno made the purchases of plaster and stucco. The signatures of Renato Padilla on social benefits documents were the result of his alcohol dependence and lack of work. Alejandra spent money from benefits on alcohol and parties, maintaining an image of normal life in which there was no place for small residents. The WhatsApp message sent in July 2022 from the IP address of an internet cafe was made personally by Sergio Diaz to calm Alejandra's relatives and prevent additional appeals to police. This step turned out to be his personal initiative, not directly agreed upon with Moreno. When the entire scheme collapsed and police began a serious investigation, Alejandra tried to shift all responsibility onto Diaz. She claimed that the inspector was supposedly directly involved in the death of the small residents. Diaz, in turn, tried to destroy medical records about his dependence at Dr. Ramirez's office, but did not succeed. The investigation promptly seized the medical card. A search of Dr. Ramirez's office confirmed the fact of illegal prescription issuance to Diaz. However, the doctor's own motive remained unclear. The doctor cooperated with the investigation, not denying the fact of prescription issuance, but claiming that he did this at Diaz's insistence, having no direct financial benefits from it. The court process, which concluded in May 2023, was public and caused serious resonance in Los Mochis. The verdict was harsh and clear. Alejandra Moreno received 35 years of imprisonment for failure to provide necessary help and negligence that led to the death of small residents. Sergio Diaz was sentenced to 7 years of imprisonment for systematic forgery and falsification of documents. Dr. Ramirez lost his license and received a lifetime ban on medical practice. However, he was not brought to criminal responsibility due to lack of evidence of his direct participation in the crimes of Moreno and Diaz. There were no moral conclusions or justifications in the case. Simply cold facts, documents, testimonies, and the harsh verdict of the court. On the evening of the 3rd of April 2024, Iria Varela, a young doctoral student of the biological faculty of the University of Santiago de Compostela, left her home on the quiet Rosalía de Castro Street in a small town in Galicia. The last person to see her was her neighbor, Rosa Torres, a 68-year-old caretaker of the residential complex, who recorded Iria's homecoming around 1840. After that, the girl seemed to have dissolved into thin air, 4 days of silence and no traces. But on the morning of the 7th of April, Iria's cat, Lua, unexpectedly appeared with an unusual object in its teeth, a piece of light green rope made of Dyneema CT15. Such material practically does not occur in this region. The investigation is led by Inspector Antonio Morales. His attention was immediately drawn to the rope that the cat had brought. Morales ordered a quick expertise, and by noon, the investigators confirmed the rarity of the material. In Galicia, this type of rope is practically not sold, especially not in such an unusual light green color. Traces of the material were also discovered in the eucalyptus gorge behind Rosalía de Castro Street, in the form of small drag marks. The witness statements from the neighbors give only an approximate picture of the events of that evening. Rosa Torres is certain of her words, but her statements cover only a short period of time. The second important witness, Iria's neighbor named Bruno Candal, told the girl's parents that he had seen her somewhat later. She had come to him for a few minutes, after which she allegedly wanted to drive to a zoological seminar in the city. No one can confirm this statement, as no digital records or GPS signals in connection with her phone were found. Two people immediately come under suspicion. The first is precisely that neighbor, Bruno Candal, an approximately 40-year-old man who lives alone and performs carpentry work. The investigators note that Bruno was the last person to see Iria on the evening of her disappearance. The relationship between him and the girl seemed friendly but superficial. However, the investigation cannot ignore the fact that it was precisely Bruno who reported Iria's plans, which were not confirmed by anyone else. The second suspicion is expressed by the investigation after the statements of a local farmer who mentioned a certain hitchhiker he had seen that evening. This unknown man, according to the farmer, stood at the roadside next to a grey Volkswagen T4 van. It seemed strange to the farmer that the hitchhiker was obviously agitated and hasty. However, the farmer could not remember the license plates. Initially, Inspector Morales' attention focused completely on the suspicious grey van. The police patrols immediately began combing the terrain and searching for traces of the hitchhiker or the van. In Galicia, there were hundreds of such vehicles, and each owner had to be personally checked. Dozens of locals were questioned, but after 2 days of operational work, the investigation received no concrete clues. The hitchhiker seemed to have disappeared together with the van. The checking of surveillance cameras brought no results. Not a single trace of a grey Volkswagen T4 was established that evening. The investigation had to admit, this path proved to be a dead end. But just when the false trail began to fade, a new document came into Inspector Morales' hands. The checking of the storage logs of the only regional dealer for ship ropes, the company Cordilleria Nautica, brought an unexpected result. In the last 6 months, the only private buyer of Dyneema CT15 ropes in light green color was precisely Bruno Candal. The purchase was dated the 14th of February 2024, almost 2 months before Iria Varela's disappearance. Now a clear connection appears in the case between the material that the cat Lua had brought the gorge behind Rosalia de Castro Street, and the girl's neighbor Bruno Candal, why a carpenter might need a specific rope for sea ships, and how this material was connected to Iria's disappearance remains a mystery for now. The investigation does not rush with accusations and prefers caution in such a delicate matter. The evidence is not yet sufficient, but the connection becomes increasingly obvious. From now on, Inspector Morales is convinced it was precisely the cat lure that gave the investigation the chance to move the case forward. Meanwhile, while the investigators carefully study Bruno's personality, the car trail of the hitchhiker is not yet completely removed from the agenda. Both directions remain preserved, but each new piece of evidence pulls the thread of investigation toward Bruno Candal. The investigators are ready to take the next step, but for now, they do not reveal their cards, because this case has, like the piece of green rope, still its undiscovered ends. The next morning began with a search in Bruno Candal's carpentry workshop. Inspector Antonio Morales received the corresponding court order. The task force arrived at the location at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning. Bruno received the investigators calmly and did not resist the inspection. Outwardly, Bruno Candal was distinguished by nothing among the other residents of Galicia. A 42-year-old man, unmarried, lived modestly and manufactured furniture to order. The workshop was located in an annex to the house. Inside, nothing remarkable except neatly arranged tools, wood blanks, and shelves with lacquers and oils. The main goal of the investigators, however, was to find an answer to the question of why Bruno needed 120 meters of extremely rare and specific climbing rope, Dyneema CT-15. The material had, as was already known to the investigation, no obvious relationship to furniture craft and certainly not to the daily life of an unmarried carpenter. During the inspection of the premises, the inspector noticed a locked door of a storage room. Bruno immediately showed the keys and expressed no objections. Inside, the investigators discovered a large wooden spool onto which the light green rope was carefully wound. The ends were carefully fused with a blowtorch. Next to it also lay the torch itself, with soot residue on the nozzle. After the inspection of the premises, the paper original of the invoice with a wet stamp was confiscated. It read, 120 meters, Dyneema CT-15, 14th of February, 2024. The fact of the purchase was definitively confirmed. Bruno himself did not deny it, and immediately explained to the investigators that he needed the material exclusively for work. According to his words, he used the rope to hang large and heavy wooden products during the oil impregnation procedure. A forensic technician expressed doubts about the carpenter's explanation. In such workshops, strong metal chains are normally used, since Dyneema ropes are strong but too expensive and unusual for such domestic purposes. Nevertheless, at that time there were no direct reasons to consider Bruno's words false. Meanwhile, the investigators received statements from another witness, Francisco Lobera, owner of the neighboring sawmill. Lobera claimed that he had noticed weak light in the windows of Bruno's workshop on the night of the 3rd to 4th of April. According to Francisco, the light burned almost until dawn. The witness remembered this clearly because he returned home from a late wood unloading around 3 o'clock at night. This strongly contradicted the words of Bruno, who claimed that he had slept peacefully at home that night and had not gone anywhere. The interrogation of Bruno proceeded calmly. The suspect behaved in a balanced manner, showed no excitement, and held firmly to his version of events. His statements were clear, without deviations in details. He insisted that the neighbor might have been mistaken or misinterpreted what he saw. However, the investigation noted this contradiction in the case files. The laboratory workers immediately began thorough examination of the confiscated spool with the rope. The surface of the material was suspiciously clean. Later, it became clear that the rope had been treated with solvent. Surface traces of Iria Varela were not found. It seemed as if this could call into question the significance of the discovery. The investigation considered this path wrong for a moment. However, the forensic technicians insisted on deeper examination of the material. Taking into account the circumstances of the case, it was decided to also open the inner part of the fibers. Only late in the evening of the same day did the court biologist make an important discovery. In the core of the rope, a single hair was found. The emergency expertise performed gave a clear result. The hair belonged to Iria Varela. The discovery completely changed the course of the investigation. From now on, the rope ceased to be just a dubious and unclear object in Bruno's storage room. Now it was a direct connection of the suspect with the disappeared Iria. The investigation's questions to the carpenter no longer concerned only his nighttime schedule and the strange purchase of the specific material. Now Inspector Antonio Morales was interested in only one thing: how and under what circumstances Iria could be connected with the rope acquired by Bruno. Bruno himself could not comprehensibly explain the origin of Iria's hair in the material and continued to insist on his innocence. He pointed out that the girl had come to his workshop several times to discuss the manufacture of bookshelves. The investigation noted that such visits had indeed taken place earlier. However, this version looked weak under the conditions of the current investigation. Now, Inspector Morales intends to carefully check other claims by Bruno as well as conduct another interrogation of Francisco Lobeira. Perhaps the neighbor can supplement his statements or provide new details. The investigation still did not have a complete picture of what happened, but the circle of questions narrowed significantly around the person of Bruno Candle and the way he used the Dyneema CT-15 rope. Meanwhile, the hitchhiker and his mysterious gray Volkswagen T4 still remained on the periphery of the investigation. As long as no new clues appeared, the investigators were forced to keep this version open, albeit without active development. After the appearance of Iria's hair in the core of the rope, the investigation switched to the girl's environment. Inspector Morales' staff decided to study her private life more attentively and find out how closely Iria communicated with Bruno and whether she herself might have voluntarily visited his workshop on the evening of the disappearance. The investigation quickly discovered another discrepancy. Why was Iria carrying a shoebox with chicks to Bruno's workshop on the evening of the 3rd of April, which she had taken from the animal shelter for aftercare? On the morning of the 8th of April, Inspector Antonio Morales visited the office of the volunteer center Avifauna Galicia. There it was possible to find an entry among the bookkeeping documents. On the 2nd of April, Iria had indeed taken 4 swifts for temporary care that needed help. To the inspector's question about why Iria had decided to take the birds home, the animal shelter employee only answered that the girl was known for her kindness and often helped animals at home, especially when it came to difficult cases. However, the animal shelter did not always have sufficient means for the complete care of the birds with medications and food. On the same day, the investigators spoke with the neighbor's daughter, 14-year-old Paula Noguera. The girl remembered that around 7 o'clock in the evening on the 3rd of April, she had seen Iria at the gate of Bruno's workshop with a shoebox in her hands. The box was slightly open, and Paula noticed small birds there. Iria looked excited, constantly looking around as if she was afraid that someone might see her. This new witness statement became an important moment. Until then, the investigation had no information that the girl had visited Bruno on the evening of the 3rd of April with a specific goal, and certainly not that she might have been troubled about her visit. On the same day, Inspector Morales conducted another conversation with the girl's parents. This time, the conversation concerned the personal circumstances of their daughter. Iria's mother confessed that the girl often had a lack of money for veterinary services and the purchase of special food. Despite the parents' help, Iria was sometimes forced to seek alternative ways to solve problems with animals that she brought home. The conversation with the girl's father, José Varela, proved to be less clear. He explained confidently that he knew nothing about his daughter recently bringing chicks home. But the investigators discovered a receipt that was issued on the 3rd of April from a local pet store in the name of José Varela. The receipt showed a rather large sum for the purchase of special food. The father did not deny the fact of the purchase and explained that this was a request from his daughter, which he did not consider important, and therefore simply did not remember. This discrepancy aroused small suspicions in the investigation. A version emerged according to which a family dispute for financial reasons could have taken place between Iria and her father. Probably the father was dissatisfied with the constant expenses for animals, and this could have provoked a conflict. However, upon more careful examination of the family correspondence and bank statements of the Varela parents, no serious financial problems were found. Although tensions on this background might have existed, no real confirmations were found that the conflict took place precisely on the day of Iria's disappearance. On the evening of the 8th of April, an event occurred that again drew the investigation's attention to Bruno's workshop. During a repeated search of the Varela family house, a container with food that was used for caring for the chicks was discovered in the pantry. The surface of the container was contaminated with small, barely visible fibers of the same Dyneema CT15 rope. Experts from the Criminal Technical Laboratories confirmed this after a few hours. Upon detailed examination, it was clear that the can with the food had already arrived contaminated at the family's house. The investigation concluded that it was precisely the cat, Lua, who had brought the container not from the Varela's kitchen, but probably from the neighboring yard of Bruno's workshop. This completely weakened the version about a serious family conflict. Now the investigation suspected that the food bought by the father might have ended up in Bruno's workshop, but not through the fault of Jose Varela himself. It seemed that the girl had gone voluntarily to the neighbor with the box of chicks and the food container, probably hoping to receive help or advice. What exactly happened after Iria was in the workshop remained unclear. Bruno had earlier explained that the girl had come to him to discuss the manufacture of bookshelves, and he allegedly knew nothing about birds. The version with the hitchhiker and the grey van received no new development for now. The investigators kept it open but did not allocate resources for checking it and waited for the appearance of new details. Now, the investigators' attention focused completely on the details of the contacts between Iria and Bruno in the last days before the disappearance. The evidence clearly showed that there was a closer connection between them than previously assumed, and the girl's behavior on the evening of the visit might testify that she found herself in a difficult or uncomfortable situation for her. On the morning of the 9th of April, the investigation received an unexpected call. The local forester, Emilio Seixas, 48 years old, reported that during his morning rounds he had noticed strange traces in the ravine behind Rosalia de Castro Street. Inspector Morales immediately sent a task force there. The examination of the ravine gave strange results. Besides the known drag marks, the experts discovered new stains of thick oil paint. The question that now occupied the investigation: what could be common between these stains and Bruno's workshop? The oil paint stains were found directly next to the drag marks that had been examined earlier. Emilio explained that he walks this path regularly and the stains had appeared recently, possibly just a few days ago. He had noticed them precisely because the fresh paint had a conspicuous shine that is not characteristic of old contamination. The investigation team took soil samples and sent them for immediate analysis to the Criminal Technical Laboratory. The experts decided to conduct a comparative examination and compare the soil samples from the ravine with the substance that had been discovered earlier in Bruno's workshop, oil paint of the teak oil walnut brand. After a few hours, the chemists confirmed that the composition of the additives was completely identical. This meant that the paint from the ravine and the paint from Bruno's workshop were one and the same. When Inspector Antonio Morales informed Bruno Candle of this result, the suspect responded calmly and repeated the version of events already known to him. Allegedly, he had accidentally spilled paint in the workshop yard about a month ago. According to his words, paint residue could have reached the ravine with rainwater or wind, considering the proximity of the yard and the ravine. However, the forester Emilio was categorical. The stains looked fresh. They were literally shining 2 days ago. Criminal chemists confirmed that the composition of the teak oil walnut paint has a specific property. After 96 hours after application, it becomes sharply darker and loses its original shine. This meant that Bruno's version about an old paint spill could not correspond to reality. The investigators suspected that the paint might have been carried by rainwater from the workshop yard territory into the ravine. However, when checked by surveyors, it turned out that the terrain did not allow water to flow exactly in this direction. The ground had an inclination that directed the water flow away from the location where the stains were discovered. Thus, the version with rainwater was completely refuted. The false trail with the rain flow was definitively closed. Meanwhile, the investigators began to recognize that there was a strong connection between Bruno's workshop, the Dyneema rope, and the oil paint. These two seemingly unconnected objects proved to be key evidence in the case. But the most unexpected discovery awaited Inspector Morales on the evening of the same day. The forensic expert presented a report that completely changed the understanding of what had happened. According to the report, the discovered drag marks clearly testified that the victim was moved after death had occurred. But most importantly, the expertise established exactly the time of death. It was no more than 36 hours ago. This meant that Iria Varela was still alive almost 2 days after the disappearance. Now the investigation had to consider that she could have been held somewhere nearby the entire time. However, despite thorough investigations already conducted, the investigators did not find the place where Iria could have been until the last hours. The experts could not give an exact answer about the place where Iria was held alive. But now the investigation knew exactly that the girl was nearby the entire time. Possibly very close. Literally one step away from the search groups that had checked the area several times. The emerging information forced the investigators to carefully search Bruno's yard and workshop once again. Despite thorough checking and several repeated rounds with forensic technicians, no traces of the girl's stay had been discovered there so far. Inspector Morales gave the instruction to immediately expand the search zone around the ravine and conduct another more detailed check of the nearest outbuildings. He also decided to question the neighbors again to find out if any of them had seen suspicious movements from Bruno in recent days. This new discovery significantly complicated the case and made it even more multifaceted and unpredictable. It became obvious to the investigation that something important had been overlooked. Some detail that could completely change the direction of the investigation. For now, all evidence led back to one place, to Bruno's workshop and his mysterious Dyneema CT-15 rope, with which everything began. The hitchhiker and the grey Volkswagen T4 remained in the case files as a version, but the investigation decided for now to stop active work in this direction and concentrate forces on Bruno and the place where Iria spent her last living hours. After the news from the forensic examiner, the investigation decided to check the version with the van that farmer Manuel Utero had mentioned. Although attention was already completely focused on Bruno's workshop, Inspector Morales considered it necessary to definitively close the question of the grey Volkswagen T4. There remained doubt. Did the mysterious hitchhiker with the grey van really exist? Or could the farmer have confused something? Farmer Manuel Utero, 60 years old, this time gave more concrete statements. He described the car again and added an important detail. The van was dirty grey, and on the rear door the logo of the furniture workshop Ebanisteria Segovia stood out clearly. This had not been indicated earlier, and Inspector Morales ordered the information to be checked immediately. The investigation contacted the company through the old telephone directory. The workshop manager confirmed the van actually exists and regularly makes trips to deliver products. A certain Josue R. was registered as the driver of the car during this period, who had departed on the morning of the 4th of April on the route Oleros to Segovia with a load of marble slabs. The police contacted Josue R. and arranged a meeting. He came calmly and confidently to the questioning. The man presented the investigators with a delivery receipt with a stamp confirming the time of unloading the slabs in Segovia on the 5th of April at 7:30 in the morning. He also showed receipts from gas stations along the entire route, where the time and date of stops were recorded. Experts calculated that Josue had driven the distance of 950 kilometers in about 12 hours, taking into account necessary breaks for rest and refueling. All documents were genuine and completely corresponded to Josue's statements. The investigators understood that if the car had actually departed on the morning of the 4th of April, it could not physically have been in the area of the ravine on the evening of the 3rd of April, or during the night of the 4th of April, when important events related to Iria Varela's disappearance took place. However, Inspector Morales wanted to completely eliminate all doubts. He asked farmer Manuel Artero to carefully look at the photos of cars belonging to the furniture workshop Ebanisteria Segovia once more. This time, the farmer hesitated. When looking at the photos, Manuel suddenly pointed to another van that belonged to the same workshop and had stood on the farm next to his property back in March, almost a month earlier. He confessed that he might have been mistaken. The car was very similar, but the farmer was no longer sure about the accuracy of his original statements. Now the version with the van and the mysterious hitchhiker finally collapsed. The investigation officially closed this false trail. Josue R. was completely excluded from the circle of suspects. From this moment on, the Volkswagen T4 van no longer figured in the case and was not repeatedly checked. Inspector Morales felt relief that one of the investigation paths could be definitively excluded. Now, all attention returned completely to Bruno Candal and his workshop, the previously found evidence, the Dyneema CT15 rope, the oil paint teak oil walnut, the drag marks in the ravine, as well as the connection with the box of chicks and the feed container. All this led back together to one person and one place. The investigation team searched Bruno's workshop once more, but at this point, nothing new was discovered. However, taking into account the forensic examiner's conclusions that Iria lived for another 1 or 2 days after the disappearance, the inspector decided to significantly expand the search zone and particularly thoroughly check all outbuildings in the immediate vicinity of the workshop. Meanwhile, while the investigators examined the surroundings, Inspector Morales scheduled another questioning of Bruno. Now the suspect had to answer additional questions related to new evidence and inconsistencies in his statements, including the lie about the time of paint spillage and possible reasons why the girl might have been near his workshop on the last evening. The investigation received a powerful impulse to move forward after freeing itself from the unclear version that complicated the work. With each new step, it became increasingly clear that the real key to solving the mystery of Iria's disappearance lay somewhere nearby, in the workshop or on Bruno Candal's property. They now definitively excluded the hitchhiker with his grey van, and this meant that the only suspect in the case remained the carpenter Bruno. Now Inspector Morales and his team faced carefully checking once more all details, all small things they might have overlooked earlier, because now there could be no mistake. The murderer was very close, and it remained only to understand exactly what Bruno was trying to hide from the investigation. On the morning of the 10th of April, Inspector Antonio Morales returned to Bruno's workshop again. This time, the investigators had a clear goal: to carefully check every corner of the room, especially taking into account the latest finds in the ravine and the definitively closed false trail with the hitchhiker. Now the team's attention was completely focused on details that might have gone unnoticed during previous investigations. The attention of the Guardia Civil Sergeant who accompanied the inspector was drawn to a strange ventilation grill under the workshop ceiling. A legitimate question arose as to why the ventilation was installed exactly there and where it might lead. When examining the workshop, the sergeant noticed another unusual detail. Along the wall and partially on the floor ran a seam freshly filled with sealant. Earlier, this area had been covered by cabinets with tools and shelves with wood blanks. Now, after their dismantling, the line of fresh sealant immediately caught the eye. The thorough examination of the ventilation grill gave even more valuable results. Expert forensic technicians discovered cat lure's hair in its inner part, as well as microscopic fibers of Dyneema rope soaked with teak oil walnut oil paint. This confirmed the investigation's suspicion that the cat somehow got into the ventilation and moved from the workshop to the outer space or vice versa. At the next questioning, the inspector asked Bruno Candal about the purpose of this ventilation grill. The suspect answered with his usual confidence and explained that this was simply an exhaust that he needed for workshop ventilation when working with solvents and varnishes. However, by this time, the technical inspector had already completed his examination of the ventilation system and declared that it was built very strangely. Instead of going upward, as exhaust systems are normally built for removing chemical vapors, the air duct went downward, deep below the ground level of the building. Such a type of ventilation installation was technically unjustified and had no practical sense for a carpentry workshop. The investigation team decided to check the theory that the ventilation shaft could lead to the neighboring house, from where the cat Lua allegedly could have entered the workshop. The investigators gained access to the neighboring building and examined its attic to search for a cat passage or traces of Iria Varila's presence. The thorough examination of the attic and adjacent rooms brought no results. There were neither traces of the cat Lua nor any traces of Iria there. The version about the neighboring house was definitively closed. Now the ventilation became even more mysterious and suspicious. It became obvious that it leads somewhere downward, under the workshop. Inspector Morales did not postpone this question for later. On the same day, an additional inspection of the space was organized. Guardia Civil personnel moved all furniture and cleared the floor at the place where fresh sealant had been noticed earlier. With the help of a special construction hammer, the investigators began carefully to open the floor area filled with sealant. Already after a few strikes, it turned out that something completely unexpected was hidden under the thin cement screed layer. The hammer struck metal with a characteristic dull sound. The investigators completely freed the object hidden under the floor. It turned out to be a massive metal hatch with a heavy cover, carefully plastered and disguised as the concrete floor of the workshop. The hatch had obviously been closed recently, and its edges were neatly sealed with fresh sealant. Everyone froze on the spot. This was the first such serious find during the entire investigation time, and it completely changed the conception of what had happened. Now the investigators understood that under the workshop floor there was a secret room, about whose existence no one had even suspected before. They did not open the hatch immediately and decided first to document the find site and gather additional information. Additional specialist crime technicians and forensic experts were called to the workshop. Inspector Morales already understood that this room under the workshop was probably exactly the place where Iria Varela had been before her death. The investigators concentrated on preparing to open the hatch. Bruno Candal, who continued to deny his involvement, was arrested and taken to a separate room for interrogations. Now his silence had no great significance anymore, since the found hatch became direct proof that the suspect was hiding an important part of the truth. While the investigation team prepared for the opening, tension grew with every minute. Inspector Morales was convinced that exactly behind this hatch lay the key to solving Iria's disappearance and the secrets connected with the cat Lua, the Dyneema rope, and the strange ventilation. From now on, the investigation completely excluded all alternative versions. Now all details, all clues, and all mysterious circumstances of this case converged at one point: the hidden metal hatch under the floor of Bruno Candal's carpentry workshop. Inspector Antonio Morales gave the order to open the metal hatch after the crime technicians and experts had prepared everything necessary. Guardia Civil personnel carefully lifted the cover, under which a narrow staircase leading downward was revealed. After descending to a depth of about 3 meters, the investigators found themselves in a small room. The main question now was one: what exactly was hidden in the basement under Bruno's workshop? Inside, the investigators discovered a chamber of about 2 by 3 meters in size. The walls were completely lined with thick layers of mineral wool, which created perfect sound insulation. This immediately explained why none of the neighbors had heard foreign sounds. In the center of the chamber stood a reclining chair, on which the experts found bloodstains during the first examination. After an emergency analysis, the crime technicians reported that the blood completely matched the blood type and DNA of Iria Varela. Next to the chair, carpentry pliers as well as a plastic transport box for animals were discovered. Immediately, a connection arose to the cat Lua and the previously found shoebox with chicks. On the floor of the chamber, the experts noticed a neat compass drawing of a knot, made with pencil. The knot turned out to be known. It was a typical carabiner knot. Later, it became known that exactly the same drawing was found in Bruno's personal notebook. After opening the hatch, the investigators again tried to interrogate Bruno, but he refused to answer any questions and invoked Article 24 of the Spanish Constitution about the right not to testify against oneself. His silence was no surprise, although it now had no decisive significance anymore. The basement with the evidence spoke for itself. For detailed examination of the find, Inspector Morales invited a knot expert from the local sailing club. He confirmed that the discovered knot drawing carabiner is mainly used for making a quickly releasable noose from strong mountaineering rope, including Dyneema CT-15. This definitively connected the knot, the rope, and Bruno in a logical chain. Meanwhile, the investigators discovered yet another unexpected object, a small GPS collar that lay in the corner of the chamber. During the first examination, they suspected that the collar might have been used to control the movements of Iria herself. However, opening the device showed that no SIM card was present and the battery had recently been discharged by 80%. This meant that the device had been turned on quite recently, but the investigators did not understand for what and for what purposes. The question remained open, and the investigation postponed it until further examinations. The most serious and grave find still awaited the investigators. In the rear part of the chamber, hidden from view by a narrow wall protrusion, a niche was discovered. There they found Iria. The investigators immediately called the forensic pathologist, who after the first examination confirmed the girl had died about 36 hours ago. This matched the preliminary conclusions of the forensic pathologist about the traces in the ravine. Around Iria's neck was tightened a noose made from the already well-known light green Dyneema CT-15 rope. The knot used in the noose completely matched the drawing found on the chamber floor and in Bruno's notebook. At this point, no doubts remained about who exactly bore responsibility for what had happened. However, despite the obviousness of the facts, many details still remained unknown. The investigators did not understand why exactly Iria became the victim and what role the strange find, the GPS collar without SIM card, played in her disappearance. The investigation was certain about Bruno's involvement. However, his motives and details of the actions remained undiscovered until now. Bruno was in custody at the station, and Inspector Morales already understood that the next stage of the investigation would be connected with uncovering the motives and the sequence of events of that fateful evening. The team of crime technicians continued examining the room and documenting all details. Now it became obvious that Iria had been captured and held in the basement of the workshop, and the Dyneema CT-15 rope was the main tool of the crime. The fact of finding cat hairs in the transport box confirmed that the cat lure had been there before, and probably exactly she had brought the first clues that allowed the investigation to find Bruno's trail. Only the most important thing remained to clarify. What exactly prompted Bruno to commit such a crime, and why everything happened exactly this way? While Inspector Morales and his team continued work at the crime scene, tension in the case reached its peak. The investigators faced getting answers to the remaining questions that Bruno had silently guarded until now. After opening the chamber under Bruno's workshop, the investigation concentrated on the suspect himself. Now all evidence lay on the table, and Inspector Antonio Morales decided to try once more to obtain explanations from Bruno despite his stubborn silence. The question that remained open: could Iria Varela's death have been an accident? On the morning of the 11th of April, the investigation team conducted another detailed examination of the chamber in the basement. Just then, a secret pocket was discovered in the seat of the lounge chair, in which a small notebook was kept. After careful removal, the experts saw that 5 pages with detailed diagrams of the quick-release knot were depicted. Exactly that knot with which the noose from the Dyneema rope had been tightened around Iria's neck. On the pages of the notebook, a library stamp was discovered, indicating that the materials had been taken by Bruno on the 27th of March, 2001-1024 in the reading room of the Galician Yacht Club for study. This meant that Bruno had specifically studied the technique of executing the complex knot 1 week before Iria's disappearance. Additionally, they found in the room a strange temperature diary where the suspect neatly recorded thermometer readings every 2 hours. Experts suspected that this could testify to an attempt to maintain stable conditions, probably for keeping living beings, including the Swifts or Iria herself. Inspector Morales decided to consult directly with the forensic examiner to find out whether the discovered knot could have tightened accidentally, as Bruno claimed through his lawyer. The expert answered clearly that additional force was required to tighten the knot after its fixation. Thus, the version about an accident looked extremely unlikely. Meanwhile, Bruno's lawyer expressed the official position of the suspect. According to his explanation, everything that had happened was only a tragic accident as a result of a voluntary game with Iria's complete consent. The investigation viewed this claim skeptically, taking into account the conclusions of the forensic examiner and the technical details of the knot. On the same day, the crime technicians completely checked the previously found GPS collar. The expertise showed that there were traces of bird droppings on the collar that exactly matched the Swifts that had previously been with Iria. No traces of the girl were discovered on the collar, and the investigation finally discarded the version that the device could have been used to control her. Thus, the false trail with the GPS collar was definitively closed. On the evening of the 11th of April, Inspector Morales organized a final consultation and gathered all previously discovered evidence on one table. Before him lay the Dyneema CT-15 rope, soaked with teak oil walnut paint, which was found in the ravine, the notebook with knot drawings, the box with feed, cat hairs from lure from the ventilation, and the temperature diary with clear time. Markings. The crime technician methodically laid out before those present the entire chain of events. Now the picture became clear and logical. Bruno had thoroughly prepared in advance, studied the technique of the complex knot, acquired the necessary materials, equipped the basement, and even provided for stable conditions in the chamber. The facts spoke for themselves, and not a single one confirmed the suspect's words about coincidence. Inspector Morales did not speak conclusions aloud, as he understood that the court should set the final points. Nevertheless, no member of the investigation team had doubts about the premeditation of Bruno's actions. The only thing that remained unclear was why exactly Iria became the object of such a carefully prepared crime. The investigation deliberately left this question open, without delving into Bruno's psychological motives for the time being and avoiding the word obsession. However, it was obvious that all actions of the suspect were planned and prepared long before that evening. Bruno's lawyer tried to convince the investigation that everything that had happened was a tragic accident, but every new fact, every detail, and every trace on Inspector Morales' table testified to the contrary. At this moment, the inspector finally convinced himself that now the full weight of evidence against Bruno had become irrefutable. Now only the court could give a final assessment of what had happened and put the point in the case of Iria Varela's disappearance. Until this moment, all responsibility lay with the investigation, which had fulfilled its task completely and flawlessly, despite all difficulties and confusing details of the investigation. Now Bruno faced appearing in court, and the evidence procured by the investigation was more than sufficient to prove his direct involvement in what had happened. The court hearing of the Audiencia Provincial de A Coruña, opened on the 18th of January 2025, became the culmination of the complex case of Iria Varela's death. In the courtroom were relatives of the girl, representatives of the police, journalists, and locals who had followed the development of events from the beginning of the investigation. The prosecutor carefully and thoroughly presented the evidence gathered by the investigation and formed before the jurors a clear picture of what exactly had happened on the evening of the 3rd of April of the previous year. The court established that Bruno Candle had intentionally lured Iria to his workshop under the pretext of helping with the chicks. Iria trusted the neighbor without suspecting that the visit would end tragically. Bruno held the girl in a specially equipped underground room under the workshop, where he sought to protect her from alleged problems with her family. This care and this protection were part of a calculated plan. Bruno studied in advance the special knot, quick release knot, which would allow him to quickly free the victim in an emergency. However, Bruno applied too much force when tightening the knot, which led to Iria's suffocation. Frightened by what had happened, Bruno tried to eliminate traces of the crime. He brought the remains to the eucalyptus ravine behind Rosalia de Castro Street and tried to present the event as an accident or incident on the road. But soon, for some reason, he returned and hid everything again in the basement. In court, all gathered evidence was presented. The prosecutor emphasized that Bruno was the only buyer of the specific Dyneema CT15 rope in the region, and Iria Varella's DNA was discovered both in the core of the rope and on the lounge chair in the chamber. The drag marks in the ravine, mixed with teak oil, walnut oil, directly matched the composition of the analogous oil that Bruno had used in his workshop. No less important was the testimony of Francisco Lobeira, the owner of the neighboring sawmill, who clearly pointed to the light in the workshop on the night of Iria's disappearance and refuted Bruno's nighttime alibi. Special attention was paid by the court to the notebook with knot drawings confiscated from the basement, and the library stamp that confirmed that Bruno had specifically prepared for the actions at least 1 week before Iria's disappearance. Despite the obvious evidence, Bruno continued to claim during the trial that what had happened was only a tragic accident. Through his lawyer, he insisted on the version of a voluntary game, whose result was allegedly Iria's unintentional death. To clarify the question, the judge invited a knot specialist from the yacht club, who directly demonstrated to the jurors in the courtroom the operating principle of the knot. The expert convincingly proved that without active and considerable effort, the noose could not tighten by itself. Thus, the version of coincidence lost any justification. The atmosphere in the courtroom became tense. The jurors attentively followed every gesture and every word and understood the seriousness of the charges brought. The expert opinions left no room for doubt about Bruno's guilt. After long and detailed performances by the prosecution, the defense, and the invited specialists, the judge announced the final verdict. Bruno Candle was found guilty under Article 139 and Article 163 of the Spanish Criminal Code. The court sentenced him to 22 years of imprisonment. The court verdict left no doubt about Bruno's guilt. It was precisely established who had committed the crime, how exactly Iria's death occurred, and what material evidence connected the criminal with the place and circumstances of committing the act. Nevertheless, one important detail remained under the seal of uncertainty. The investigation and the court did not succeed in clarifying to the end whether Bruno intended to kill the girl in advance, or whether his actions crossed the line only at the moment of her refusal or resistance. This remained an area of assumptions, since there was no evidence for a clear assertion. The announced verdict did not provoke objections from those present in the courtroom. Iria's family accepted the verdict calmly and understood that although this would not bring their daughter back to them, justice had been established. Thus, the case that had begun with the strange behavior of the cat lure and an unusual piece of Dyneema rope came to its conclusion. Precisely this small detail allowed the investigation to uncover such a carefully planned crime and establish the truth that was hidden under a layer of masking and denials by the suspect. The consequences of this case were reflected in the lives of all who were connected with its investigation. For Inspector Antonio Morales, it became an impressive example of how even the most insignificant details can lead to the exposure of terrible secrets. For Iria's loved ones, the court verdict brought not only relief, but also final understanding of what had happened. For the locals, it was a reminder that even in the quietest and most peaceful places, danger can lurk that no one expects. The Iria Varela case was closed, but it remained forever in the memory of those who knew this story.